doesn't particularly change, but we'll dive right into it. One of the interesting things that I've learned from using Zyto technology is that, particularly the e-box, when you start using the e-box, you develop an incredible amount of empathy for the human condition, because you realize that people tend to live dysfunctional lives because they were born into dysfunctional patterns. And that's, I think, primarily the reason that we all endure dysfunction to varying degrees. So here we are at birth, and not at birth, here we are at conception. We all start out as a zygote. And I've observed that, everybody gets born, and some of us, I should have, I'm using the thing that here we go, let's try this again. This is a really cool PowerPoint if I don't screw it up, okay? So some of us grow up to be beautiful, and some of us grow up to be gifted athletes, and some of us just grow up. And some of us have physical challenges that we live with all our lives. And some of us die when we're young, and some of us live to be old. But it seems to me, as I pondered the whole situation, that there is a common denominator, and everybody gets a body. So it doesn't matter if you have a crippled body, or a healthy body, or a beautiful body, or a fat body. We all still have bodies. And that, as I have watched patients, particularly as it relates to e-box, and I wondered, you kind of try to make sense out of life. You get to be an old guy like I am, and you start thinking about those things a little bit more. And it just seems to me that is the lowest common denominator. There isn't necessarily a level playing field in the world, except for this one element. And so I got to thinking about, well, why is that significant? If that's the lowest common denominator, it must be important. Now, I had an epiphany. Occasionally I'll have these epiphanies. Well, one day, when I went flying, I used to own an airplane. This is a picture of the kind of airplane I had. I sold it last year. But one day, I was out at the Provo Airport, and this is a picture of the airport where I used to fly out of. And that's the control panel on that particular airplane. And this is the procedure you go through when you take off. After you've walked around your airplane and made sure the wings aren't going to fall off, then you get inside it, you turn the engine on and get it warming up, and you turn the radios on and you listen to some pre-recorded information about the airport. And then you contact ground control, and you'll say, ground control, you identify yourself, and you say, I'm parked over at this place, and I'm ready to roll, and I've got information, whatever, and I'm departing to the south. Then the ground controller, who sits up in this tower, says, okay, taxi to the runway. And they tell you which runway to taxi to. So you taxi on out, and on your way out to the airport, there's an area that's called the run-up area. In the run-up area, you stop your plane, and you turn it into the wind, and then you go through some additional checks. Make sure your magnetos are working okay. Make sure your control panels all work. Make sure that you do a run-up. And when you're through with that, then you radio the ground control again, and you say, this is airplane such and such, and I'm continuing on to runway X, whatever they told you to do. So you continue on to the runway, and when you get to the runway, you stop, and you switch your radio frequencies to the tower, and you call the tower and say, I'm here sitting at the end of the runway, I'm ready to take off, and then they tell you when it's okay to take off. Well, on this particular day, I got out to the runway, and I flipped my radios over to the tower, and nothing happened. And so there I was, sitting at the hold short position, and I couldn't talk to anybody. And so I said, Pro control, this is blah, blah, blah. So I'm turning my radios on and off, and I'm flipping and doing this, and nothing happens. Finally, I don't have any choice. I just turned my airplane around. It wasn't a busy day, fortunately. So I turned my airplane around and taxied back to the mechanic shop. And it turns out that I had a bad switch. And so for a couple $100, they fixed it. That's one of the disadvantages of flying. Is if anything goes wrong, it's always expensive to fix. But it occurred to me, though, through that experience, that the primary reason that you get a body is because it's a communication device. Now, that epiphany didn't come to me just because I was flying that day. Just that the flying actually is what created the epiphany. But mostly what our body does is it talks to itself, or it communicates with the universe. And there's a website. If you go to this particular website, it's a YouTube video that's been put out by the University of Utah, and it talks about self-communication. There's all kinds of stuff on the web about self-communication. It's not a new or strange concept. It's well accepted. One of the reasons why this epiphany came to me is based on the things I've done historically. This is a picture of a device that's called a limbic arm. This is a piece of equipment I built in the late 90s, and let me tell you how it works really quickly. There's a little tray right there. Down underneath it, there's a particular antenna array. It had a serial port. It plugs into a computer. And there's a piece of software that goes with it, and the software will take a digital file, and it does some magic things to the digital file, and then it transfers it down to this unit. This is called I can't remember what we call it anyway, this unit, okay? and the system came with a little capsule called the transfer capsule. The transfer capsule was a little injection molded plastic unit into which we put some particularly some water that was structured in a particular way, and we would seal that. It was a memory capsule essentially, and you'd lay that memory capsule onto this position right here. You'd put the lid on it, and then you'd hit the go button, and what would happen is it would download the data through the wire, and it would broadcast it inside the chamber, and the transfer capsule would then capture the data. You would then take the transfer capsule, and this pen was called the diffuser, and you would slide the barrel. This barrel slid forward, and you drop the transfer capsule in here, and then you twist the back, kind of like a mag light, and it turns on this light. This happens to be an LED light, and you would then shine that LED on your skin, and it would transfer the information into your body. Now, why would you do that? Well, because it's cool, and you guys are strange, so all of everybody in this room would do that. It was designed as a learning tool. When we did some tests, well, let me tell you some of the experiences that we went through. I have a daughter who is a very accomplished piano player. At the time, she was in high school. She was probably 16 or 17. And she used to take lessons from a concert pianist. I think her lessons were like $375 a month. I mean, so she was a serious student, and we made sure that she was a serious student. She used to practice between 2 and 4 hours a day. And the way that they would learn music is she would go to a lesson, and her professor or her teacher would give her maybe a 30 or a 40-page score of music. She would then go home and memorize the music, and then over a course of several weeks, they would work on the technique for that piece. But they worked on the technique after she had memorized it, and that's the way they did it. So one day, after I built this piece of equipment, I said, Candace, let's try an experiment. Let's take this score of music and let's scan it into a computer, let's download it, and let's zap you with it and see if it makes any difference. And so we did. And about 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later maybe, she came back from her lesson, and she said, a funny thing happened today. Dr. Hatch said that I memorized my music faster than any of his other students. And I said, really? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, do you? And she said, well, I don't know if I memorize it faster than did this thing with the limbic arc, it seems to be easier for me. And I said, well, how is that so? I mean, what's it like? Do you cerebrally comprehend it easier? And she said, no, it's kind of like my fingers just know where to go. Well, that was intriguing to me, and we did some additional experiments. We took a control group and a treatment group, or whatever you would call it, and we came up with a list of numbers, and I think it was 20 or 40 numbers. And it was just a random selection of numbers. And what we would do is this. We had the control group who, they were our guessers, and the other group we would zap, okay? So we took the list of numbers and we loaded it into the limbic arc and we zapped everybody in this group. And then what we did is we took the list of numbers and we had everybody in a class and we held it up in front of the class for about 30 seconds. And we said, okay, everybody memorize this list of numbers. And after 30 seconds, we put the list down, and they all had a piece of paper and pencil, and we said, okay, write the numbers in the correct order. They would go through and they would write the numbers in the correct order. And the group that had been zapped scored 10 to 20% better. The average was just over 11% better. And we thought, well, that's interesting, but maybe they're just smarter. And so we did it again with different numbers, different order, only we reversed. We made the control group the treatment group now, and we made the treatment group the control group. And these guys now scored just over 11% better. And we found that we could do that. We could go back and forth. It didn't matter. It was like flipping the light switch. The guys that got zapped would score 10 to 20% better. We said, well, that's really exciting because maybe we can just make people smarter. And so we would take groups of numbers and we would zap some people and we'd say, okay, now we'd like you to write the numbers down without ever seeing them, without ever studying. And it didn't work. If you didn't engage your mind in the process, just the download from the limbic arc would not make you a better guesser, which I think is significant. So the question is then, how does that work? And here's what I think. There's different aspects of your anatomy. You got a brain. This is your brain, not on drugs, and this is your heart on a Valentine's card. And in Chinese medicine, the heart controls the mind. So your heart actually has a very significant connection to what your brain does. And in addition to that, then you got your body, and this is your body after you forgot to put your skin on in the morning. And your brain would represent the CPU. If you're going to liken this to a computer, so we'll use that metaphor for a minute. Your heart is essentially the hub, and your body is a memory bank. How many of you have do any kind of hands-on work with your patients? And during the course of that, have you ever triggered what's called a body memory? You have, yeah. You store memory in tissue, and sometimes I've had patients who I've stuck needles into, and when the needle goes in, they go, oh my gosh, I haven't thought of this thing in 30 years, of this 30-year flashback. Sometimes they'll have a spontaneous eruption of emotion, like they'll start to laugh uncontrollably or almost fly into a rage, and it's like, whoa, this is scary. But what's happening is it's triggering body memory. In many instances, you can actually palpate the body memory. It feels kind of like a jelly bean without the hard shell on the outside, and you'll work it, and all of a sudden, it'll dissipate, and the memory comes back to the person who will express the memory. So your body functions as a storage device, and in addition to that, we have on our body, on the surface, we have a bunch of acupuncture points, and we have chakras. And acupuncture points and chakras represent satellite dishes, or function as satellite dishes to connect us to the outside universe. Now, why is that significant? That's significant because in the quantum world, there are fields that are independent. For example, some of you in this room speak languages other than English. And English is one of those dots on this point. The English language has its own field. The Dutch language has its own field. The Spanish language has its own field. Physics has its own field. And we're going to talk about fields more in a minute. But the information exists in the universe, and when we tap into the information, certain things happen. I've got to tell you a story. A number of years ago, I used to make my living as a real estate developer, and I was pretty good at it. I went broke, but that wasn't because I wasn't good at it. It's just that my timing was really bad. But I had a couple of partners, and we were pretty smart. We were pretty good about what we did. But we got into a recession, and we couldn't sell our property. I mean, our stuff that we were selling, just nobody was buying it because the interest rates had gone up. And so we sat down together one day and said, okay, what are we going to do? And we came up with this incredibly novel, brilliant idea. And then there was this conference held in San Francisco. And the conference was for real estate developers and bankers. And this was back in the days when the bankers were raping all the developers. It was a brutal time. But it looked like a good conference, and so I said, look, I'm going to go down to San Francisco and go to this conference. So I went down, and there was probably 400 people from all over the world at the conference. And at one point in the conference, we were all in the same room, and there was a panel at the front. They were having a panel discussion, and it was kind of a Q&A with the group. Well, I'll be darned if some guy from California didn't stand up and say, hey, let me tell you what we're doing with our property. And he disclosed to the entire group this brilliant, unique, new idea that my partners and I came up with. And I thought, wait a minute, that's our idea. How did he come up with the same idea? And then this old guy across the room from Paris stood up and said, we did that about 50 years ago in Paris, and let me tell you what happens. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. I mean, I came away, I didn't make $1 million for having gone to the seminar, but I came away from that seminar realizing that thoughts are things. And when you think something, in fact, I was much younger than I am now. I came away wondering, actually, am I capable of an original thought? Or do I just channel thoughts that already exist? I don't know. But I came away with an appreciation that ideas are entities, and they exist independent of me. And I think when you learn, you just tap into the field where that information exists, and you become more knowledgeable. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you thought of the idea. So what happens is this. You engage your mind, and when you do that, information is downloaded through your satellite dishes. It passes through your heart, and bingo, the idea occurs in your mind. Now, let me see if that happens again. Yeah, isn't that cool? I back up and show you again, but it's okay. We're going fast. So, the significance then of this body that we all inhabit is that it connects us in some significant way to the universe, and it's really a communication and learning tool. Now let's get into kind of the nuts and bolts of the Zyto stuff. Because what we build and what you have with Zyto equipment is really an instrument that takes advantage of at least these theories. Okay? I'm not standing here telling you that what I've just told you is absolutely true. I'm telling you that it's based on some epiphanies I've had and some experience I've had over the years, and it seems logical to me that this is the reality of mortality, I suppose. What I've got now is just a series of questions. I'm going to go through them really fast. There's about 7 questions that we get asked more often than anything else at Zyto. And I'm assuming that they're common among quickly. And part of those will come back to what I've just told you, but the first one here is, is Zyto equipment, do we build medical devices? The answer is no, we don't. We build 4 different pieces of equipment. Currently, the Pro, which we're going to spend most of our time on today, the Balance, which is a mini Pro, you might call. E-Box is a voice technology. It does what's called perception reframing. I think Dr. Cowan's going to spend a little time this afternoon on that. And Compass, which is it's actually a unit that's sold to network marketing distributors. It's a consumer device. It's very simple in its operation. The reason that we only sell these 3 items to health professionals is because of the level of complexity of the information. You get information from the Pro and the Balance that could very easily be interpreted as a diagnosis, and it is not a diagnosis. If we put that information into the hands of someone who doesn't have any training, they would immediately jump to the conclusion that this is diagnostic, and you can get yourself in trouble. So we only sell those things to health professionals to keep everybody safe. What we provide is not diagnostic, but it is a decision support technology. If you have a hand cradle and a piece of our equipment in your clinic, people walk in, and the first thing they're going to think is, oh, this is a cool little medical device. And then you run through and say, well, no, this doesn't do any diagnosis. And they say, well, what good is it if it can't diagnose anything? Well, the answer is it can do a lot of good. And here's an example of something that's good in your clinic that's not diagnostic. When a patient comes in, you usually, at least I did in my clinic, I gave them a clipboard and a pen and a piece of paper, and on the paper we had a printed form. It was called the health history. And the first thing someone would do was fill out the health history. And then, when they came in to see me, part of the initial intake process was to review the health history, and I would go through and make notes on it. So that information had clinical significance, but it was not diagnostic. I would never look at a health history and say, oh, you've got cancer, or you've got a cold, or you've got something else, because there's just not enough information. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. So data can be clinically significant without being diagnostic, and that's what the hand cradle and the Zyto technology does. It essentially extends the health history at a subconscious level, or to a subconscious level, and it allows you to gather data that can be significant clinically, but is not diagnostic. Now, you may be saying, well, he only says that because legally he can't say it's diagnostic. No, I'm saying that because it's true. You cannot make a diagnosis based on our equipment. And I maybe will be able to give you more reasons why, but let me tell you the legal reasons why. My background is I've been 25 years in this kind of technology. My degree is in Oriental medicine, so I've got a fair amount of clinical experience as well, but I have 25 years of building equipment that's used related to energy medicine. I built the first FDA-registered EAV device in this country. And after I got my FDA registration, a company called BioMeridian bought that technology. They wanted the FDA filing. And so I've been around the energy medicine industry a number of years, and I have a fair amount of experience, even with the FDA. The current Zyto technology that we're using, I started to develop in 2001, and in 2004, the very end of 2004, started to sell it. It took about 3 years to build. And when I was done, I thought, this is really cool. This is the next generation of EAV, and if you don't know what EAV is, it doesn't matter. But I thought I'd build another medical device. And so I got on the FDA website, and I started to do some research, and they said, well, if you want to file, you file what's called a 510K. And a 510K is just a registration with the FDA, and once they approve your paperwork, then you're free to move your technology into commercial distribution. And so I was interested in filing the 510K. One of the rules currently is if you'll hire from the FDA, they say if you'll hire one of our approved consultants, then we'll waive our fees because you'll be giving all your money to our consultant who does all of our work, and when we get it from them, we just have to stamp it instead of spend a lot of time with it. So I thought, well, that's good. We'll go to one of your approved consultants. So Underwriters Laboratory was one of those. We contacted Underwriters Laboratory and said, we'd like to hire you to help us process a 510K, and they said, great, send us down your information. So we sent down the information, and they came back a week or so later and said, we're sorry, you don't qualify for filing with the FDA. And I said, how come? And they said, because you're not a medical device. And I said, really? They said, no, you're not, we reviewed all your data, you're not a medical device. Well, I thought I was. And so I said, well, I think you're wrong. I think that we are. And they said, well, send us some more information because we're not convinced with what you sent us. So I put together some more information, sent it down to them, and they came back again and said, and I won't bore you with the words on here. They basically said, look, you just don't fit the definition. You're not measuring any system of the body. You're not diagnosing. You're not treating. You're not doing any of those things. You're not a medical device. And if you're not a medical device, the FDA won't issue you a 510K. It's that simple. So I said, well, woohoo. I mean, I was quite happy. This is the last communication with Underwriters. Our contact there. She said, I just got replies back from our notified body auditors again after sending in your additional information. Unfortunately, they are still saying it does not qualify as a medical device. Well, we then hired an attorney in Washington, D.C. because we wanted a second opinion. And we sent him our information, we sent him our communications with Underwriters Laboratory, and he came back and said, that's right, you're not a medical device, but he said the trigger here is the claims that you make. If you claim to be diagnosing, you will make yourself a medical device. And so be careful what you're saying, but you're not a medical device, so you don't need to worry about it. So we're very careful not to make any diagnostic claims. And if you make diagnostic claims, that's your privilege. But if you get sued and you want me to testify as an expert witness, I will say you cannot diagnose with our technology. Okay, that's the truth. Okay? So, occasionally, this is an email, you don't need to read the whole thing, I'll tell you the story. I'm assuming this is one of your patients or somebody's patients, a fellow from Ohio sent this email to me one day. And my guess is he's probably an engineer. And he said, I went into a practitioner's office and they tested me, and then I went back and went to your website, and your website's just full of fluffy stuff, that there's no hard science here. I'm not convinced. And I wrote back and said, look, if you're thinking that we're a diagnostic tool, then your criticism is correct, but we're not. We're a communication device. We're gathering information from your body. It's not diagnostic. The fact that we use clinician testimonials as evidence that our technology has value is perfectly legitimate because we're not claiming to be able to diagnose anything. So, you should treat the Zyto technology with the same weight and value, or the data you collect with the same weight and value as you do your health histories. So if a patient comes in and says, yes, everyone in my family dies of heart attacks, and I'm having chest pains, that can be significant clinically, but it doesn't diagnose anything. But I'm not going to run a cancer panel before I run some heart stuff, right? And the same thing is true with the Zyto technology. It just helps you become a better guesser. It actually increases the odds if you'll use Zyto technology in your data collection process, and you use that data as part of your decision-making process. It increases the probability that you'll make the right decision the first time by 500%. So it makes you an incredibly good guesser. Okay, how does the hand cradle work? Lee, how am I doing on time? Okay. The hand cradle is a biocommunication device, and biocommunication, as we use that word, means a direct connection between your body and a computer. And it's done for the purpose of facilitating better decision making. How can your body communicate with the computer? This is how it happens. This is a cross section of a cell wall. And this is the bilipid layer that constitutes the cell wall, and through that you've got things like gates. This is a gate in a closed position, and you have receptors, and these receptors have little antennae on the end, and they're tuned for particular signals
if a signal comes along that stimulates this particular receptor, it will move from this position to this position. That's confirmation 1 to confirmation 2. That receptor then triggers the gate opens, and good stuff comes, it lets stuff in the cell. Now, let's assume for a minute that this is glucose, and that this is the insulin signal, and this is an insulin receptor. So what happens is your body gets the blood sugar going up after lunch, and it triggers your pancreas. Your pancreas starts to secrete insulin, and insulin is a hormone, and hormones are characterized, one way they're characterized is they have a very high signal quality. It doesn't take a whole lot of a hormone to do a whole lot. And so insulin, when it's secreted by the pancreas in your bloodstream, it starts to sing a song. And it's the insulin song. And what happens is that signal then starts to be heard by these receptors, and the gates open and let the glucose in. Now, let me just step through this one more. One of the significant elements of cell structure is this bilipid layer. The bilipid layer is organized in a crystalline fashion, and it acts very much like a liquid crystal, like the screen on my computer. You know, if you touch your screen, it has that little liquidy look feel to it. It looks like you pushed it in a pond or something. Well, that's a liquid crystal screen display. And one of the reasons that cells are built that way is because it facilitates the reflection of signal. Now, this happens to be a crystal radio, the thing on the left there. I doubt that many of you in here are old enough to have ever built a crystal radio like that. Oh, some have. That's good, yeah. Okay. Really? Mark, you're that old? Yeah. I'm impressed. I mean, it was just mostly us old guys who were raising our hands here. And there you are. Well, here's how they work. They're really cool. This under here, I mean, when I used to build, we used to take the inside roll of a piece of toilet paper, and you wrap copper wire around it, and then and that sits underneath here, and then you put your little metal armament, and on this side you'll attach your antenna, and on this side you'll attach your headphones. This is a crystal, and that little wire reaches down and touches that crystal. So the antenna, that's a wire, and you string it out to the tree outside your bedroom window, which is about 100 feet away. And then you just get your earphones and plug them in here, and you slide this guy down here, and you'll pick up one radio station. You can listen to the radio station. If you want to change stations, you just slide this along, and it picks up different radio stations as you go along. The thing that makes this work is, well, what it's doing is it's attenuating the electromagnetic frequency from the radio station and converting it to acoustic energy, and that's what you can hear. So that's what's happening. Have you ever known anybody who gets certain kinds of fillings in their mouth, and all of a sudden they can hear a particular radio station in their head? You ever? Yeah.
I should tell this story.
Yes. Yeah.
Particularly if they have amalgam.
Well, and I've heard of some people who put in like crystal fillings, really high expensive fillings, and I said, well, it's probably not so bad unless it's a country western station. I'm just kidding. Anyway, this is the same thing. The electromagnetic frequencies are out there. We just don't hear them because we don't attenuate them. But the crystal radio attenuates it. The key is this crystal right here. If the radio ever stops working, all you have to do is put that wire. You can take that wire and lift it and scratch it somewhere else and put it down in a different position on the crystal, and bingo, the radio stations come back on. There's no battery with the crystal radio. They're much more sophisticated these days. They use diodes instead of crystals.
Is this one from Radio Shack?
You can go to Radio Shack and buy the components to build a crystal radio. But instead of using a crystal these days, you'll get a little diode. It does the same thing. They're not as archaic looking, but they probably work better. Anyway, this crystalline structure then acts as a receptor and a springboard for signals. So let's go back to the insulin experience. You eat breakfast this morning, your blood sugar goes up. Your blood sugar, as it goes up, it actually changes the pH of your blood, makes it more acid, which is not good. So your body says, hey, something bad's happening here. Let's get rid of this acid. And so your pancreas, in response to that stimulus, will secrete the insulin. Insulin, you don't secrete enough insulin to bathe all the cells in your body. So it's not like all of the insulin receptors on every cell of your body gets a little bath of insulin. What happens is this. Insulin moves into your bloodstream, and the radio station for insulin comes on. Insulin, and it's kind of weak to begin with, but the signal gets bounced around. You see, as you move your body, as your heart beats and you breathe, you're compressing these cells, and as you compress the cells that have this crystalline structure around the outside, it actually generates energy. And that energy will then facilitate the transmission of the insulin song energetically throughout your body. And so insulin, and then more insulin comes in, insulin, pretty soon, insulin! It's sound, and everybody goes, oh, I know that song. Well, these guys say, yeah, I know that song. And so bingo, the signal comes in, the gates open, the glucose goes in. pH goes down in the blood, the body's happy, the insulin gets reabsorbed, good to go again. So the process is more of an energetic process than it is a chemical process. The chemistry is important because that's what triggers the signal. So you can't have one without the other, but it's more the broadcast than it is the bath. Okay? Now, the process then is just one of stimulus and response. Stimulus is the glucose in the bloodstream, the response is the insulin. The stimulus is the insulin, the response is the gate opens, the glucose gets transmitted into the inside of the cell. It's also, you can call it a stressor and a stress response. You see, a stressor is an external stimuli. Stress is actually an internal response. Stress is generated from the inside out. You might have an exposure to a virus. That's a stressor. And your body responds by mounting a stress response. And the stress response might be a fever, sneezing, histamine reactions, you get a runny nose, all those things that we call symptoms are just stress responses to a stressor. Okay? Now, remember, what we're talking about is how can your body communicate with a computer? Okay, that's the question that we're discussing. This is your brain, and in the particular area where the arrow points here, you can see what's called RAS. RAS stands for Reticular Activation System. That part of your brain is evolutionarily the oldest part of our brain. We share that brain area in common with more animals on the planet than any other part. The reason why we're the top of the food chain, I'm not sure we are at the top of the food chain, but the reason we think we are is because of this part of the brain, which is more developed in us than it is in other species. But this part of our brain is called the reticular activation system, and sometimes it's called the reptilian brain. One of the functions of that part of your brain is it screens all your phone calls. Now, this is what that means. At the conscious level, I have the ability, and you have the ability, to process about 2,000 pieces of data a second. The problem is that below the level of the reticular activation system, we process over 400 million bits of data a second. There's part of you that knows what your blood pressure is. There's part of you that knows what the hormone level is. There's part of you that knows what the hair on the back of your neck is doing. There's a part of you that knows what your temperature is on every part of your body. You see, all of those things have to be managed, and all of that data gets communicated. But frankly, I just don't care. I like that to be on autopilot. And so I just don't pay any attention to it. About the only thing that I'm interested in is if I'm going to have diarrhea. I want to know that. But aside from that, I really don't care what my bowel function's doing. Right? So what happens then is, all of this data that gets processed down here, we don't ever hear because our secretary screens all the phone calls. when the diarrhea phone call comes through, hello, I think you might want to know. So that phone call gets through, and we're off to the bathroom. That's what the reticular activation system does. Now, there's all kinds of things then that happen below the level of that, of the RAS, and one of those things is galvanic skin response. 10 minutes? Okay. We're really going to bust fast, okay? Galvanic skin response happens below the level of the reticular activation system. Most of us have the ability to control that, and an exercise would be this. If I said, hold out your hands and raise the temperature of your right hand, you could do it. And if I said, now cool your right hand and raise the temperature of your left hand, you could do it. Some of you could do it fast, some of you are slow, some of you have to practice before you can do it, but we can all do it. But you can't do it very fast. So we're not efficient at it. What happens is, that's actually what we're measuring. When you put your hand on the hand cradle, we're measuring subtle changes in the electrical properties of your skin. And the way that occurs is the computer will output a stimulus in the form of a signal, and your body will respond in a shift in temperature or galvanic skin response. It's the same thing. Okay, the stressors that come through were called virtual stressors, and a virtual stressor is just a computer signal that represents something. Some of you may be afraid of spiders. When I put this picture up on the screen, you're going to have a physiological response. If you're afraid of spiders, just looking at this picture will cause your heart rate to go up, your pupils to constrict, you may perspire a little bit more, your respiration will change. If you like spiders, you may have exactly the opposite response. And if you don't really care, you may not do anything, you know. But you don't have to have a spider crawl on your arm to create a response. Now, if I give you another stimulus, you may or may not have a response too. If you live in Holland, this will have no reaction. You know, Tio, this won't do anything for you. But anybody who lives in the United States, this will create some kind of a response. And if you owe these guys money, then you'll have one response, and if you don't, you'll probably have a different response. But this is not the institution it represents. These are just symbols that mean something. And if they have meaning to you, then it will create a response. Okay, the same thing happens with the computer. The computer outputs a signal, and the signal means something to your body, and your body responds accordingly. Okay, how are these understood by everyone? In order to understand how a virtual stressor is understood universally, we have to talk about some different concepts. The first concept is the concept of opposition. This is called a monad, and it represents, it's called the yin-yang symbol. This is yin, and this is yang. That's a Taoist symbol, and it just is an image to represent this concept that everything in the universe is opposed by something else. Okay? For every up, there's a down. For every in, there's an out. Okay, so that's the first concept. The second concept is represented by this image. This represents a magnet. And this is the North Pole, the South Pole. These are called the flux lines. And this is the magnetic field. So it's this concept called field. A field is a sphere of influence. Everything and everyone has a sphere of influence. You have a field. I have a field. Your grandmother who's dead has a field. And just because she's dead doesn't mean you're outside of her field. Fields are not bounded by time or dimension. Okay? Now, there is a place where all fields exist, and it's called the zero-point field. Now, you can't see it on this projector. I'm impressed. A little box. Okay. It's called the zero-point field for a couple of reasons, and I'll only say one. The one reason is because that's where everything sums to zero. If you took 1 cubic meter of space in this room, and you took all of you've got an incredible amount of energy that sits in that much space. But it doesn't do anything because it's all opposing, it's all balanced, it's called potential energy. But if you took that potential if you took all the negatives and pointed to the positive side or vice versa, you would release enough energy to boil all the water on the planet. In 1 cubic meter of space, there's that much potential energy. That if we could do that, it would create an explosion, and the bathtubs and the seas and everything else would boil. It would boil all the water. So there's an incredible amount of potential energy in the universe. In fact, it even gets more fantastic than that when you start considering the amount of potential energy there is. But that's called the zero-point field, and remember the body with the little dots, those are the fields. Those represent the fields. The one I had on the previous slide. So here we are. We live in the zero-point field. When this concept became a new theory, some guys at Princeton said, well, if the zero-point field is a real thing, then maybe we can demonstrate that it exists by influencing it in some way. And so they built this thing called a random event generator, and basically it was this kind of a tool. It was an instrument that would measure the flow of electrons or photons. And in a totally balanced random system, you're going to have hits, as many hits coming in from the left as you do from the right. And they built the machine, and sure enough, that's what they got. Then they said to a guy, okay, I want you to sit in front of this machine, I want you to focus your intent, and I want you to intend more hits from the left than the right. And then they measured the outcome, and lo and behold, he could do it. They thought, wow, that's really fantastic, so here's some interesting trivia. So they got this guy to do it, and they found out, that he can actually have an effect on the flow of photons against this random event generator. Then they thought, well, I wonder if a woman can do it. So they got a woman, and sure enough, women can do this just like men can. And then they got curious, and they said, well, what if we take a team of guys? Can they do it better? The answer is no, they do it worse. They can do it, but they don't do it as efficiently as a single man. They took 2 women, they do it less efficiently than a single woman. They then took a man and a woman as a team, and they could do it 3 times better than a single man or a single woman. I'm not sure what this means, but they took a man and a woman in a committed relationship. They did it 6.5 times more efficiently than a single man or a single woman. That doesn't have anything to do with this, what we're talking about, but it's an interesting trivia. The point is this: the zero-point field exists, and we have influence over it. We interact with it. The interaction that we have with it is primarily below the level of the reticular activation system, and it's called objective consciousness. Now, the reason it's called objective consciousness is because it's not subject to our conscious awareness. It exists, and it is what it is. Okay. Here's how, I've really got to go fast, so let's keep going. Here's how we get information into the software that we use as our virtual stressors, and this is why it works. When you type in, so let's say that I've got a piece of corn, I want to program it into my Pro. I get a sample of the corn, and I type in corn. When I type in corn, the computer, it goes through this proprietary process that our software is designed to do, and it creates this incredibly long string of ones and zeros, and a signature that is absolutely unique. Then what you do is you take the tower and you take the sample of the corn and you put it in front of the tower, and you hit the link button on the software, and the computer will output the signal that's designed, that's been created, that represents this corn. It outputs the signal, and in the field that's created at the tower position, you create this point of convergence, and the 2 energy patterns merge, and we load the data into a field, in the zero-point field. Now, what happens then is, you see, it gets loaded into the zero-point field, and because you live in the zero-point field, you have access to that data. So at that instant, you essentially teach everyone on the universe that this signal means this corn. So if I take my equipment and I go to Holland and run an assessment, I'm going to get reliable results there. If I then get on the plane and go to Japan, it doesn't matter. Everybody on this planet will instantly speak this language. because we live in the 0-point field and we all have access to that data. Okay, what do the results mean? I'm going fast, Lee. Am I going fast? Oh. Okay, thank you. Okay, the results mean this. In order for the results to mean anything, we have to be able to differentiate. So you have to be able to make a comparison. It's called differential decision making or differential diagnosis. This is what happens when your hand's on the hand cradle with the probe. In less than a half a second, we go through this process. What we're doing is we're tracking the baseline in real time, and we're reading the responses as they occur. So if you take this blown up area and it's up here, then you've got these different time sequences. So at sequence number 1, we measure the baseline. At sequence number 2, we output a stimulus. This might be the stimulus for the corn. In position 3, we measure the response. We then compare the baseline to the response, and we express that in terms of what we call a DR. DR is a word we invented. It stands for deviation ratio, and we had to have some word to explain what our math showed you, and that's what it does. So then what happens is we then wait for the next time sequence. We measure the baseline. We then output the stimulus. We measure the response. We compare the two, express it in terms of a DR. The real magic, and I always have to brag about this because it took 6 months to figure this one out. The real magic of how and why our technology works is we figured out how to track the baseline in real time. Until I was able to figure that one out, it didn't work. But when you can figure that out, that's why it works. Okay, deviation ratio. If you get a plus deviation ratio, it means that the response was more coherent than the baseline. Coherence is a measurement of copacetic coexistence, I guess. We'll talk about it in a minute, but it's greater coherence. A 0 DR means that the response and the baseline were essentially the same. A negative DR means that the baseline was more coherent than the response, so the response was less coherent. Okay, now coherence means 2 or more things that coexist without conflict. And usually we think in terms of light, like a laser, that this light is a laser light. And the reason I can shine it all around the room and it comes out as a little teeny beam is because the energy that's emitted by the laser diode here emits the energy in a way that none of the waves interfere with each other. So they don't cancel each other out. And so when they get to their destination, they're still a little teeny group of, coherent waves. But coherence means it's not limited to light. If you're married, you know that if your relationship is coherent with your spouse, you're much more productive. If you get in an argument with your spouse, your relationship becomes less coherent. It affects your whole life because you now have this interference pattern that you're living with. Okay. I'm going to end with this one. I think as soon as I finish this, we'll just get the last slides fast. This is the most commonly asked question. Why don't I get the same results twice? Okay. There's a couple of reasons why you don't. One is because you expect to, and when you don't, then it becomes disappointing. So people come in and they'll look at your equipment and they'll say, oh, this is like a blood test, or it's like a blood pressure cuff or a microscope, or I think this is a urine sample from a Smurf. But it's not the same. This is not a diagnostic device, but you think that it's a diagnostic device, or your patients think it is, and so they think, well, it's a diagnostic device, it should always give you the same results. So that's the first problem you have to overcome. You don't pick up the telephone and expect to have the same conversation every time, even with the same person. Now, that aside, here's some of the reasons why you don't get the same results. This is a continuum. Yang and yin, okay? Yin and yang. Yang is characterized as being male, external, hot, and active. Yin is characterized as being the opposite. Female, internal, cold, and sedentary. Now you'll notice this is a sedentary man exclusively one or the other. In fact, nobody's absolutely yin or absolutely yang. If you were, you'd be dead. If you take your anatomical components and you plot them on a continuum from yang, the most yang, to the most yin, the most yang component of your body is qi. The next most yang is blood, then you go to body fluid, and then you go to tissue. It means that qi is the fastest to move. It's the squirreliest part of your anatomy. We happen to be interfacing with qi. We're measuring body energy. If you want to predict where my health is going, measure my qi. If you want to know where my health has been, do a tissue biopsy. Because it takes a long time, not that long, but it takes a couple of weeks at least, for whatever I introduce at the qi level to be reflected at the tissue level. That's why when patients get on vitamins, you don't take them off and change them every day. It's because it takes a matter of weeks or months before they actually get the tissue good out of them. Okay, so the first reason you don't get the same results all the time is because qi is squirrely. And the fact that I'm interfacing and I'm stimulating qi when I run the test with my hand on the hand cradle means that if I immediately repeat the same exercise, I'm going to get different results because I've shifted the qi to a different position. Okay, that's one reason. The other reason is represented by this. You go over to your friend's house, they say, "Do you want anything to drink?" And you say, they look in the fridge, say, "What do you got?" "Well, I got a Diet Coke." I don't know. What else have you got?" "Well, I've got some apple juice. I've got some orange juice." "How about some water?" "Yeah, I got water, but it's really crappy. It's tap water and it smells like swamp." "Okay, maybe I'll have the orange juice." Okay, so what's happened? Well, I've gone through this selection process, and I don't know. And if they had said, "Look, all I've got is Diet Coke," I might say, "Okay, I'll have a Diet Coke." You see, normally you don't drink Diet Coke, but if that's the only thing you have to drink, you'll take it. Your body does the same thing at a subconscious level. That's another reason you get different results. A third reason is because we acclimate. If somebody walks up behind you and they crash some cymbals and surprise you, you're going to jump. You're going to have, all kinds of physiological events. And if in a few minutes they do it again, you won't jump as much. And if they do it again, you might not jump at all. And if they do it again, you might just push them away or leave. You're going to acclimate. So you walk into a room that has a funny smell, and you go, "It smells kind of funny in this room." And in 30 seconds, you can't tell. You forget that it smells funny until somebody else walks in and says, "It smells kind of funny in this room." You say, "Yeah, it does. I noticed that when I came in too." We acclimate. And so that is what happens. When you put your hand on the hand cradle, if you leave it there for a long time, if you look at the response curve, which you can't see with our equipment unless you have some other stuff, but I'll tell you that initially the responses go all over the place, and then they settle down. In about 3 seconds they settle down, and you start to get consistent data. But if you left your hand there for a long time, your responses would continue to go thinner and thinner until they go completely flat. So you acclimate over time. Now, it would take a long time for that to happen, but that would happen. Okay, this is what I see quite often. I don't see exact duplicates, but I do see comparative results. For example, you run a test. Here's test number 1, and what shows up is something related to lung and large intestine. Then I say, "Oh, that's cool. Let me run this test again and see if this is a legitimate technology." And I run it again, and lo and behold, the things that were up here on the first test are now down here, and what's come up to the top is something that relates to skin and sinus. And I scratch my head and say, that doesn't look like reproducible results to me. And then I run it a third time, and I end up getting a hit on something that relates to allergy and adrenal. Well, if you don't know what you're looking at, you're going to be disappointed. But if you know what you're looking at, you're going to say, well, okay, this makes sense based on the symptomatology of the patient and knowing that lung and large intestine are paired meridians. That's an energetic pattern that's paired. Skin and sinus are related to lung and large intestine. The skin is the outward expression of the lung meridian, and the sinus, the large intestine meridian, terminates at this point right here. So a strategy for treating any kind of sinus problem is you treat the gut. Okay, then you get into large intestine and lung. And then you do it again, and the body says, oh, okay, dummy, you didn't get it the first time. Well, here, maybe you'll understand this. Give me this. And then it says, well, look, you're really irritating me, but maybe you'll understand this picture. Well, the problem is we confuse ourselves by going forward because we gather more data than we know how to interpret. So what happens is, and we'll see comparative results. There were a couple of studies done. Let me tell you one in particular. This study number 2 was done in China in December of 2007. We were invited into a major hospital in Beijing. It was Hospital 301, which is the largest hospital in the world. They have 6,000 beds. It's a huge place. And it's an expensive hospital. It's totally modern. It's where all the military guys go, and the top political echelon from Beijing will go there. Well, they have this 8-story diagnostic center that's run by a general, Dr. Chang, and he invited us over because they were looking for, I won't tell you all the details because I don't have time, but the bottom line is this. We went in, and for a week, we had one of our technicians go into this hospital, and they gave us 207 patients. Now, their patients, when they come in for a workup, they give them a pair of pajamas, and for 2 days they stay in the hospital, and they just run this battery of tests on them. And at the end of 2 days, they then compile this book that basically says, okay, here's the results of all your tests, and this is our diagnosis. We went in with a balance, and we did a scan on the same 207 patients. They then gave us the records for those 207 patients, and a doctor by the name of John Diamond, who's been trained as a pathologist, he lives in Reno, he was there with me, and John took the data back, and then he ran a correlator. He set it out on a matrix and ran a correlation. And he said, okay, given what they have determined on their diagnostic information, you would conclude the following